Greetings and salutations! Welcome to video number 5 in this series where I, Joe Collins, tell you about some of my adventures in nearly 40 years in broadcasting. This is a true story, what I'm about to tell you. It really happened, although some of it stretches belief. In late 1993, I left WTAR and WLTY, shortly after they were sold, to go to Smith Mountain Lake, which is in the western part of Virginia near Roanoke, and help a friend of mine who had bought a small AM station there, a little daytime AM. He figured he could make a go of it. It didn't go well from the beginning. It just got off on the wrong foot. The weather was awful. I had come there in mid-November, just before Thanksgiving, and they hadn't really got much going by the time I had gotten there. And the weather turned really bad just after Thanksgiving. It was snow and ice all winter long and very cold, which kind of brought the economy to a stop. So by February, I was in deep trouble because they could not pay me. And I had brought up my wife and her son, my stepson, and we had just had a very small child who was only a couple of months old. And she was not working at that time, and so I needed a job, and I needed it yesterday. Now this is where luck or fate or whatever you want to call it steps in, because the first phone call that I made looking for a job when I had decided it was time to go was to the radio station in Rocky Mount. They had an AM and an FM, WNLB AM and WZBB FM. And yes, those are the same call letters of the same radio station that I'm working for now, boys and girls. And I will get to telling you how that happened in another video. But today we're just going to concentrate on my time working for WNLB AM. Well, I called the radio station and just asked to speak to the boss, and I got the owner on the phone, and I explained to him my situation, and he said that it was lucky that I had called him when I did, because he had an immediate opening. Apparently, the person who had been doing the Southern Gospel show on the AM station had had a heart attack on the air. They worked in the morning, and they ended up having to be rushed to the hospital and had emergency surgery, and they were expected to have a very long recovery. So he needed somebody to come in and take care of that. And also, he was getting ready to change the format on the AM to Oldies, and he had already hired a morning personality to work on the AM, but this person was working out a contract or couldn't come for some period of time. So I was basically going to come in there and fill in the gap. And the guy he hired, by the way, was a fellow named Ron Morris. Ron deserves his own video, and he will get one later on. So I said yes, that I would come down there, and I did it, and I showed up. And my job was to turn this little radio station on in the morning. This was a daytime AM. There are a lot of those in small towns. But this one was a little bit different. It had what is called a PSA. Now that's a pre-sunrise authorization. That meant that you could sign on at a fixed time in the morning, like 5:30 or 6. I think this station signed on at 6. And you could do it at very low power, and then after the sun came up, you could increase the power. Also, they could run in the evenings to broadcast sports. So they had this very complicated license on 1290 AM that allowed them to get away with that stuff. And then during the day, their maximum power was like 3,400 watts or something weird like that. Complicated schedule of different powers at different times. I remember that. And this is the board they had. This is the same picture I used in the last video, but it was basically the same board. And they had 2 transmitters at the studio. This was a combo operation. The AM station had their transmitters right there. The FM had transmitters somewhere else. But the studios for the AM and FM were right there. So that was convenient, because if you had to do all this crazy switching of power and whatnot on the transmitters, at least you could do it locally. They had a Gates BC1T for 250 watts and 1,000 watts. And then they had, that's another picture of the Gates BC1T. And then they had this guy right here. This is the only picture I could find of one of these things. This is a 1959 Continental 5,000 watt transmitter. The one that they had, I found out later, they had bought from KDKA in Pittsburgh. It was KDKA's backup transmitter with its own tower. If for any reason the 50,000 watt transmitters didn't work or they had to take the main antenna system offline, they actually had another antenna hooked to a 5,000 watt transmitter that they could broadcast on. That was it. The studios for this radio station were located at the bottom of Glenwood Drive. Glenwood Drive intersects with Scuffling Hill Road near the top of Scuffling Hill. This is right on the outskirts of Rocky Mount. Actually, at one point in time, I lived on Scuffling Hill, and I could see the tower right out my front window. So that was nice. I could walk to work. But the bad thing was that being in this neighborhood on the outskirts of town and being at the very end of the road meant that they couldn't get three-phase power. They had single-phase power coming in. And therefore, to get this big transmitter to work, they had to have quite the elaborate generating system set up. So in the morning, to get this big transmitter on the air, you would go outside, rain or shine, snow, whatever, sleet, didn't make any difference, and you would open up electrical panels on the side of the building while standing in puddles, and you would flip switches that routed power to a dyna generator, which took the single-phase power and ran a motor that would run another, like a generator that would turn it to three-phase. I don't know exactly how it worked, but that's how they ran this transmitter. And because it was only 3,400 watts, this transmitter had been detuned anyway to try and get the output power down. And it was just a real pain in the butt to get on the air. This was a lazy old girl who didn't want to work. It was constantly being looked at by engineers, and it would only work for short periods of time, and then it would just refuse to start in the morning. You'd try and turn it on, and it would throw breakers, and it just all kinds of crazy stuff. So most of the time that I was there, we were on the Gates transmitter. The format was Southern Gospel in the morning on this station, and then at 10 o'clock they would switch it over to simulcast what was on the FM until sign-off. I guess at that point in time it was the easiest thing for them to do. So all of the revenue that the AM station made on its own was made in the morning or when they were carrying sports at night. That was it. And the only sports they covered was local high school football. The Southern Gospel format is interesting. Maybe those of you who do not live in the southern United States don't quite know what I'm talking about with that. When you say gospel music, a lot of people around the world will identify that with African American church music, or black gospel, if you will. Now, there are radio stations all over the country that play that kind of music, and it's quite a big radio format, especially in big towns with large black populations. Southern gospel, on the other hand, is a little bit of a different animal. It is popular mainly in the South, and it is a country-based Christian music. We're not talking about Christian contemporary. It is a mix of traditional gospel, like you hear in the church, and more country-flavored songs, all singing about Jesus. Now, don't get me wrong, I like me a gospel song every now and again. But Southern gospel has to be my least favorite music ever. I mean, it's just, not individually, but just as a steady diet of it. I just don't want to hear it. That's just not my cup of tea. It's a mix of different artists. It's white artists and black artists in Southern gospel. Some of it's more country, some of it's more traditional, like I said. I didn't know a thing about it, and I learned very quickly, though. But that wasn't the problem. Playing the music wasn't a big deal. There was actually a music chart that came out once a week, and you could go by that, and you knew what you were doing, and since it was only 6 to 10, it wasn't that hard to figure out what to play. No, that wasn't the problem. And it really wasn't fighting with the crazy transmitter that was the problem. No. What made this job crazy was the fact that they had gone out and sold to the big 3 funeral homes in this little town a feature called In Memoriam. In Memoriam was obituaries on the air. Now, at that time, and 30, 40 years ago we're talking about here, it was not unusual for small town radio stations to feature obituaries in the morning along with their news. And it might even be sponsored by the local funeral home. It's just a service. It's a small town. Somebody dies in the county, that's news. And there's a tasteful way to do that. I think that the way they were doing it at this radio station was the most tasteless thing that I have ever done in my entire life. Because they had allowed these funeral homes to fax in full obituaries, and I was required to read the whole thing. Not just, Bob Smith passed away last night, his funeral arrangements are still, whatever. No, this was the whole obituary. And if you've ever read obituaries, like in the newspaper where they print the whole thing, some of them are worded very strangely. Bob Smith departed this planet last night, hand in hand with Jesus, who took him to heaven, and he is now in heaven with his ancestors. Bob leaves behind his 3 loving wives, Jen, Joan, and Georgette, and their 14 children and 23 grandchildren. Their names are, and you would literally read all the names, and then Bob was a principal at a local school for many years, and then retired to keep bees in the country, or some crazy stuff like that. And you would have as many as 5 of these things in a row. So you can imagine if you're reading a page of stuff, it's a minute long. This feature could run 5 minutes, easy. Just reading about dead people. It came in on fax paper. Okay, a fax machine. We're talking about the old thermal fax paper, and you know how bad that looks anyway. And if they didn't scan it in properly, it was horrible. Plus, sometimes they would send you stuff that was handwritten. Now, I have a vision problem to begin with, and I'm in this studio with a microphone, like trying, the microphone and a magnifier over here, trying to read this. It was horrid. I remember even saying something about this. Do we really have to do this? Yes, that's what they paid for. Okay. Other than that, I was also awful on the air because this is when I found out for sure that I was not a morning show person. I've done that 3 times in my career, and every time it has been disastrous. Unless it's like one day a week. I can pull it off one day a week. So I've done it more, but more often than not. But it's been here and there, like I'm filling in for somebody, or it's a weekend morning or so. I can do that. But like Monday through Friday, no. I don't know my name in the morning. I'm not necessarily in a bad mood. I just can't think. And it shows on the air. Also, for this job, I was late on several occasions because it was hard to get motivated from all the way on the other side of the county where I lived at on the lake to Rocky Mount, which was a good 25-minute drive. So that was real fun. So the big day finally came, and it was time to switch the format of the AM stations from the Southern Gospel to Oldies. Great. I thought for sure this will be the end of the obituaries. There is no way that these people are actually going to change the call letters of this radio station to WFYN for fun, as in Fun Radio 1290, and still read obituaries. So the magic morning came, and it was time for me to do what I knew how to do best, and that was play real music on the radio. I was very excited. I was like, this is going to be all right. And I got in there and looked on the log, and sure enough, there was in memoriam still listed. I thought, well, this has to be a mistake. So I didn't read any obituaries that morning. I just played the commercial for the funeral home and went on. Boss comes in about 9:45, 15 minutes before the show is over. He was commenting on some of the music I played and didn't like the fact that I played No Time by the Guess Who at 6:30. He was like, doesn't that rock a little hard? We want to ease them out of bed. And I'm like, okay, whatever. I just looked at him and said it was a number 1 song. I figured I'd play it. And then he says, you didn't read any obituaries. Did nobody die last night? And I went, I don't have a clue. I didn't even look at the fax machine. And he went in and pulled a bunch of stuff off the fax machine. He said, well, there's stuff here. You should have read this. I said, Donnie, it's Fun Radio, 1290 WFYN. Are you serious? You really honestly want me to read obituaries with an oldies format where we're calling it Fun Radio? Well, yeah, they paid for it. I can't remember exactly how that ended up, to tell you the truth. I've been racking my brain since I've been prepping to do this video. I think what happened is that I did do it for a couple of days, and it was generally decided that it sounded awful, like it didn't before when we were playing the gospel music. And that we would no longer do it, and that they would get a commercial instead. And so that ended that. I only did mornings for a little while longer on the station. Ron Morris, who was hired actually before I even started there to do it, finally had worked out his obligation, and he came in to do mornings. And for a short period of time, they moved me to afternoons on the AM station. And so Ron did mornings and I did afternoons. And for whatever reason, that didn't catch on, or they didn't sell enough of it to make it worthwhile. So I was switched over to part-time, which meant that I would work on the AM, running ball games, and work on the FM when I needed to. And the FM happened because there was one night when I was asked to do an overnight, which I didn't think about it at the time. Second time it's happened to me and I didn't know it. It was an audition. Well, when I got over on the FM, I was more at home. It was more of a regular format. It was country music. I was familiar with it. I was okay. I think I did rather well. And apparently they did too, because that's when I started doing some part-time stuff on the FM and some part-time stuff on the AM. And between the two, I was making pretty good money. Now, later, I was asked to do 7 to midnight full-time on the FM. So I ended up staying there for quite some time, even though I was hired temporarily. And I thought it would be temporary as well. I was there for years after that. Now here's the kicker, boys and girls. One of those divine ironies of life. When I was offered the job to do 6 to midnight on the AM station, it was 6 to midnight. I think I said 7 earlier, but yeah, 6 to midnight. One of the caveats was that I would have to work on Sundays. Sunday morning, to be precise. Signing on the AM station. Playing gospel music. Because they decided that they were going to keep gospel music for Sunday morning until noon. So I came in and did a 6-hour gospel show. Also, I babysat the FM on those mornings because they would pre-record and put into the automation system a Sunday morning show, the big boss would. That was always kind of fun. Did that for years. Even after the AM station was sold, I did Sunday mornings. I wouldn't necessarily be on the air myself, but I would be in the station, babysitting, doing production, all that other stuff. So I did that for about the next 3 years. Sunday mornings, playing the gospel, putting the preachers on the air. We used to have live preachers that would come out to the station, and you would put them in the voiceover booth next to the AM station, which happened to abut the kitchen. So while they were on the air, you couldn't go get coffee. You'd have to go out the back door where the transmitters were, and you'd have to walk all the way around, and you'd have to go in the FM station, and then to get a cup of coffee while the preachers were preaching. And on the log, I'll leave you with this thought. It said, "Do not allow preacher on the air unless presented with a check." It was pay in advance, boy, and if you didn't pay, you didn't go on the air. Fortunately, while I was there, all the really nice preachers that had bought airtime on Sunday morning at WFYN, they had a check in their hand and never had a problem. And they were very nice people, too. And I think that's why I ended up staying at that station so long. As backwards and as strange as they were to me, they were super nice people. And you know what? They still are. Because I still work for WZBB. After being away for nearly 30 years, I'm back on the air there and have been since 2018. But that's a story for another video. If you would like to hear me talk to Donnie Brooke about my experiences at the original WNLB and confront him about those obituaries. You can hear that in the description to this video. I will put a link to another video. It's from the 30th anniversary show at WZBB that we did in March of 2018. That was very shortly before I went to work there. Actually, no, I started in 2019, wasn't it? Was it 18 or 19? I can't remember now. Oh well. I've been there a while. I can say that. I think it was actually it was November the 25th of 2019 is when I started there. Yep, officially. Thanks for listening, boys and girls. I'm gone. We'll do another soon.